Hello and welcome back to this podcast on Diplomacy Next. I'm being joined by Dr. Swasti, who has appeared many times on our podcast on European geopolitics, security, and Russia-Ukraine war, and many other things. Her participation has always added value to this podcast. Apart from that, this has helped also us to contribute to the discourse on IR as the digital promoters and digital content creators on international relations as a subject and as a discipline. I would like to welcome her on this podcast again. Welcome, Dr. Swasti.
Well, thank you, Mehraj. It's a pleasure joining you, and good to see you, and good to also, I would say, is be. I think this is our third podcast together, if I'm not wrong, on geopolitics. So,
Yeah.
well, yes, looking forward to an interesting conversation.
There are many things been happening around the world, Dr. Swasti, and your expertise on European geopolitics. Apart from that, I would like you to start with this thing that Hamas has attacked Israel, and there are analysts who have been writing on this issue that it was not only a massive attack, but also it has been able to generate a new kind of a narrative around this war where Benjamin Netanyahu has declared a war against Hamas and has even said that they know how to extract the cost of whatever has been inflicted upon them. Uh, all the European countries, mostly or most of them, have backed Israel or against the Hamas, and there have been also protests by some parts of the community in Europe itself. How do you view as an analyst to this all stuff that's happening in Middle East and its impact on the foreign policies of Europe?
So, Mehraj, let's put these things into perspective. And one of the things is that what has happened with respect to Middle East is really it's kind of appended all the the different parties' strategic calculus. And I'll explain to you how that has happened. You see, if you remember that after the Abraham Accords that were mediated by Donald Trump, there was a process of normalization which was underway. I mean, I'm talking about the larger geopolitics, right? So when you're looking at West Asia from the perspective of India, from the perspective of, countries in Europe, of course, there was a process of normalization that was underway since 2020. And this normalization was happening on two broad axes. The one was the normalization between Israel and UAE, and of course certain other smaller powers out there, and the other was the normalization which was already achieved, and the other was the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And of course, looking at it from India's perspective, India had already made certain forays into that region. I mean, we have great relations, if you know, with the most of the countries in the region, and we were already there. We had joined this American-led I2U2, if you understand. That was a product of that normalization, etc. And very, very recently, just to give the viewers a sense of what was happening very recently, if you remember at the G20, India and certain powers had certain countries had signed what was very famously what came to be known as the IMEC, or the economic corridor. Okay, and these kind of developments were in the interest of almost everybody who was a signatory to these projects, and it was a new, I would say, this was really indicative of a new era of how the world looked at Middle East, how the Middle Eastern powers, like the West Asian powers, their own dynamics were changing. But perhaps now that we know that, for example, perhaps Hamas was preparing for this particular attack on Israel long time, as you know, that Israel had deployed most of its own forces towards the West Bank and not towards Gaza, which happens to be on the southern side of Israel. So long story short, it was pretty unprecedented. It was quite unexpected. Now there is, of course, news that Egypt had given some intelligence to Israel that Israel had not really paid heed to, etc. But anyway, this is still something that will analysis over which will keep coming in the coming months and years. But what had happened was that it actually abruptly put an end to the normalization that was underway. So whether it is from Europe's perspective or if it is from India's perspective, I'm not a West Asian expert, so to say, but I can definitely tell you that this lot of these projects which were underway because a certain normalization was happening, there is now an abrupt end to that. I would not say perhaps end, but definitely a pause to that, because like you said, after that attack on Israel by Hamas and Israel's very, I would say, strong counteroffensive. Right now there is a major problem in Gaza. The Gazans are undergoing a lot of problems. The Israelis have cut them off from electricity, etc., etc. Now they also have somewhere a justification because they were completely taken by surprise by the sheer brutality of the way Hamas had attacked the Israeli citizens and children in the cities of kibbutz, etc., and at that Supernova Music Festival. So not getting there, what I'm trying to say is that there is now Saudi Arabia has now suspended the normalization talks with Israel, and the most so to say, preeminent impact can be seen on the discussions on IMEC, which was a connectivity project. And this connectivity project was supposed to start from the western coast of Mumbai, go all the way to West Asia, cross Dubai, then go to Haifa in Israel, and from there, go to the Greek port of Piraeus, and then, onwards in Europe. And this was also a project which was backed by the American PGII initiative, which is a G7 initiative. Now, so this is one of the ways in which the world, the strategic calculus of so many countries has been upended. The other major impact that I'm interested in seeing, Mehraj, is that the impact this particular development is having on the war in Ukraine, because now you know that, of course, America was the major provider of military aid to Ukraine, and all that military aid will definitely, now there is somebody, another front that has opened up, which is that America had already almost backed off, if its central command and most of its assets had already been shifted to either the Indo-Pacific Command or elsewhere. So now, of course, America will have to sort of redeploy its assets in West Asia again. So, the CENTCOM will have to be, so to say, they will have to ramp up their capabilities out there. They will have to sort of give more intelligence capabilities out there, because it is an intelligence failure as well. So what I'm saying is that on these two aspects, particularly I can see a direct impact, which is that the American aid, or the level of aid, or the commitment to Ukraine, which was already, I would not say faltering, but it was very clear that perhaps by the end of 2024, there will be a marked shift in how the Americans were supporting Ukraine, because they would be busy with their own elections. And if the Republicans come back and somebody like Donald Trump comes back, for instance, it would perhaps be end of the road for American military aid to Ukraine. And now, even before 2024, we are still towards the end of 2023. And now we are seeing that there is another front that has opened up for America, and particularly the pressure that will be felt on the delivery of 155 ammunition shells is going to be felt in Ukraine as well, because those were the kind of things that Ukraine was really depending upon. So I think these are the two things that we see, in terms of the major, so to say, changes. But then there are also secondary and tertiary things that would be seen, because, in Europe, you see there is already a lot of unrest with respect to their stand on Israel. Most of the Europe, along with European Union, has already stood up with Israel. You see a lot of unrest in their societies, where there are a lot of pro-Palestinian, I would not say pro-Hamas, but at least pro-Palestinian rallies. And this could turn into a major law and order situation, especially in a country like France, that have, very openly outlawed any such thing that condemns, so to say, the suffering of Israelis, etc. So all I'm saying is that though it is not really happening at that mega level, but it actually turn into a law and order situation again in Europe. And lately, Europe has not really been very peaceful because of, especially France, countries like France, where you saw there was recently a major, public unrest and uprising against the killing of Nahil. And before that, they had reforms with respect to pensions, and those were, those also saw kind of a backlash from the public. So I I can see that Europe is not very quiet. There is a lot happening in respective countries and respective societies. And then, of course, there is a war in Ukraine, which is going on anyway. And the war in Ukraine has its own dynamics. I'm sure we will talk about it later. But just to sort of make matters a little more worse for everybody, what Europe is also undergoing is that recently there was a leakage found, a kind of an attack, done on the Baltic Connector pipeline, which is somewhere near the territory of Finland and Estonia. And it also once again shows how vulnerable is Europe's critical infrastructure, and a kind of a failure on the part of Europe to sort of you know, deploy military capabilities around the critical infrastructure, because this is the second time in recent past that something like this has happened. The more famous one was, of course, the attack on the Nord Stream 2. But this one is, of course, the Baltic Connector pipeline. And again, the Finnish authorities have been, getting into investigations. They are saying Russia has done it. Of course, they have not really, claimed it officially, but then the point is that there is a lot of vulnerability, and then there are layers of vulnerability. So it's not good news for the world, and particularly for Europe, which is anyway undergoing a massive, so to say, security crisis because of the war in Ukraine. So those would be my, opening remarks with respect to what is happening in the world right now.
Coming back to this vulnerability thing. I mean, Europe, when Russia-Ukraine war started, Europe could find itself in a kind of a vulnerable situation because of a certain invasion of its one of its allies. And number one, number two is that now the theater is open in Indo-Pacific, and now this sudden and surprise attack on Israel. I mean, Europe itself as a geopolitical unit, if we talk about it as researchers, as analysts, or as students of international relations, how accurate and how realistic it will be to conclude that whatever commitments that were actually agreed upon at G20 heads of the state summit vis-a-vis Middle East, and the importance of this fact is that the theater in the Indo-Pacific still remains open, and now this Middle East again, where you said rightly that it has to redeploy its assets in the region. I mean, all this thing is just adding to the vulnerability of Europe, isn't it?
No, why not just Europe, Mehraj? It's generally I think the global order by itself is undergoing a major complexity. It's undergoing a major, so to say, paradigm shift in many, many ways, because let's understand that the Russia-Ukraine war, of course, it is impacting Europe, but then it is also impacting the countries of West Asia and Africa, because that is where you see the impacts of the food crisis to be very bad. There is a fuel crisis, there's a fertilizer crisis, etc. So the Russia-Ukraine war had already brought about seismic, shifts. Okay, it had already sent seismic shock waves across the entire world. I mean, there are only certain regions that are perhaps not as affected, but then by and large, if you see with respect to the kind of this complex and this very intertwined crisis that it has generated with respect to the 3F, which is food, fuel, and fertilizer, already the entire world was reeling, under the pressures of this particular, threefold crisis. And then again, remember that this problem was exacerbated by the fact that the entire world, and not Europe, again, I'd reiterate, was already in an unfinished project of recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. So just as you were trying to put together your supply chains, just when you were trying to put together, or the markets were trying to bounce back and people had started to normalize, there was this war which triggered this 3F crisis for the whole world to which affected the entire world. And just when things were, people were getting together for G20 and more constructive decisions had just started to, get taken in terms of, for example, the new development bank of the BRICS. I mean, I'm referring to the BRICS new development bank, and, all the new things that were coming with respect to how to make the climate financing more resilient, how to sort of bring the countries together when it came to these extremely important issues issues of global inequality, etc., then there you go. And then you have another whammy, which is coming from the Middle East this time. So, of course, it is like I said, that it is the world was already where there was a lot of complexity and uncertainty in the world. And while you can't really help the complexity right now, we were trying our best to, decrease, or so to say, bring down the uncertainty by trying to put in place certain structures and processes, and then those processes are eroded again. So I would say it is a very, very uncertain time, and it is going to impact not just Europe, but everybody in the world, including India. So now it all depends on what role can diplomacy play. If you can bring down the tensions somewhere in the Middle East, of course, for America to sort of understand where to deploy what. Of course, there is a seething crisis in the Indo-Pacific because the Taiwan front is still very uncertain, and you know what I'm referring to, because all this while, ever since 2022 started, we have been discussing if Ukraine today can be a Taiwan tomorrow, okay? And there are countries in the world like Japan that have been pushing this narrative extremely forcefully everywhere, that security is indivisible, okay? If the security remains indivisible from transatlantic to Indo-Pacific, and these security theaters are merging in many ways. So if tomorrow there were to be a crisis in the Taiwan Straits, how would that disrupt global supply chains? How would that disrupt a lot of other relationships? And you can definitely see that the world was already in the middle of militarization. There was an unprecedented militarization happening. You've been seeing how countries like Philippines, etc., they've been getting into these understandings and treaties with the US. So the point is that there is already a front which is going on in Russia and Ukraine, which is triggering a set of crises all over the world, and they can be encapsulated as the 3F crisis. To make matters worse, just as G20 under India's historic presidency was trying to bring back some faith in multilateralism and was trying to do its best by giving a voice to Global South, getting Africa Union in, thinking about these new economic corridors where everybody would be better off. Suddenly there is a crisis in the Middle East. Now, again, just to sort of reiterate, and then there was already a source of tension which was there in terms of the cross-strait relations, right? So yes, I would say it is a huge mess, but now it depends completely on diplomatic efforts, and I think a lot of, I would say, restraint. You really have to exercise a lot of restraint in bringing back some order to reduce some degree of this complexity. Okay, I'm sure, this, and I mean, nobody has this one solution that can fit everything, but I think states can definitely come together to sort of reduce this complexity to some extent. And that's what perhaps I would be expecting from world leaders too.
Quite fair enough. I mean, if we come back to the main theme of this podcast is that Russia-Ukraine war. We have entered 599th day of the war, despite all the pushback from the Western countries, especially to back up Ukraine. What's the current status of the war? I mean, you have been talking about. You have also visited France recently. I mean, last week, I reckon. Where do you see this war going? Is actually the US-backed world order kind of falling short to whatever the commitments it makes, or whatever the bar it has set? Or we are just entering the next year of the war with same thing, with also not any results that are being actually kept open for the public or for the analysts like students to follow?
So well, two things, right? I mean, there's on the one hand things which are happening on the battlefront in terms of assessing what US's commitment to Ukraine means. Has it been useful or not? How far has been able to contain the war, etc. And there are certain ways of looking at it, and I'll tell you about all of those ways. And then there are the key takeaways that are important for students. Okay, so I think we're talking about two things. Let me just first tell you about the developments. So like you rightly said, the war has already entered its I mean, very soon it'll be 2 years of the war, right? We are already in now in the middle of October, and in just in another 4 months we would be entering the second year of the war. So it is something. This war has already become a protracted war. This war has already become a war of attrition. Okay. Now, with respect to what exactly is happening now, I think everybody knows that. This particular war is being fought for the 15 to 16% of the Ukrainian land that Russia is holding on to. Definitely, in terms of why Russia is waging this war, I think so far there is no clear consensus on what really is the Russian objective. Because I remember talking about it even earlier on your podcast, is that the theory of NATO's eastward expansion is not really a very adequate, or I would say the correct, so to say, analytical framework to understand the war. Because I think I've told the viewers also earlier that it is a very Russian narrative, okay, of saying that if they had not attacked Ukraine, or if they had not started to demilitarize Ukraine by way of the special military operation, Ukraine would have joined NATO. Because the truth of the matter is that NATO does not make another country its member till the time that particular country or applicant, in this case, has a territorial dispute. So for sure, the argument of NATO's eastward expansion is not really such a monolithic argument. There is more. If you talk to the Europeans, they look at it in a different way. It has more got to do with sphere of influence, and perhaps President Putin thought that this is a good moment for him to sort of reclaim Russia's lost sphere of influence. Why do I say so? Is because if you remember, after America's retreat in Afghanistan, there was this huge debate in the world about America sort of going back and becoming more focused on the US itself. And this happened under, this was how the Biden administration, so to say, started, its innings, right? I mean, and that American withdrawal from Afghanistan left this vacuum, and they were focused primarily on the Indo-Pacific. So perhaps this was a miscalculation on the part of President Putin, who thought that now the US has pivoted towards Indo-Pacific. They're focused on China, and in the Indo-Pacific, everything has now, the maritime dimension is getting more attention, by the US, whereas the continent of Europe is really dependent on Russia for its gas. They are dependent on China for the business. NATO is divided. France is trying to, play this thing of strategic autonomy. So perhaps this is a time that you can really attack another country and try to reinstate your sphere of influence. Okay, and I think the perfect, so to say, alibi or the cause that could be given was, of course, NATO's eastward expansion. But the truth of the matter, if you talk to the East European countries, is that they have systematically maintained that they have lobbied for years to get into NATO. Because the point is that after 1991, if you look at the European security dynamic, they were always fearful of their territorial integrity and sovereignty. And in many ways, what has happened in Ukraine has vindicated that. Now, this is one side of the story. The other side of the story is that for sure there was an American influence in Ukraine after 2014, especially when Crimea was taken back by Russians. America had been rearming Ukraine in a massive way. America had been training Ukrainians in a massive way. And 2014, this area of Donbass was under almost say a de facto Russian occupation, because they those are the areas which are where most of the Russians, they say that ethnic Russians live, and they are not happy with how the mainstream Ukrainian government would perhaps not value their their language, and would have all these things. So that is the second narrative, and the point that Russia then attacked, and of course this is now, I think, very, very well known that they wanted to take down Kyiv in 5 days, and they couldn't do that because they perhaps made a gross misjudgment on the part of Ukrainian readiness, and the Ukrainians were far more took down the Russian armored vehicle columns, and Russians had made this blunder of getting in Ukrainian territory without giving the adequate air cover. And that remains to be a mystery even till now as to why did Russia enter that into Ukrainian territory and all the way to Kyiv without providing air cover. And the Ukrainians were quick to understand what to do, and they started to sort of, shoot down the armored vehicles, that column of the armored vehicles. And then Russia, and that was the beginning. and after that it's become a war of attrition, because the Ukrainian demand from the Europeans and the Americans, of course from mostly from Americans, is that they give them more offensive weapons. America has not been giving offensive weapons to Ukraine. America is only giving them enough weapons to keep the war going. American argument there, Miraj, is that they don't want a direct confrontation with Russia. I mean, NATO doesn't want a direct confrontation with Russia, number one. Number two, more responsibly, the entire Western coalition is extremely wary of pushing this war to the level of a nuclear brinksmanship. So you have to understand that that is a very real danger. Even though analysts all over the world have argued that President Putin will not press the nuclear button, but you can't say such things with guarantee. And that is one fear. I mean, you see, there is a lot of nuclear saber rattling from Russia as well. I mean, every few months, Russia would deploy certain optics where they are taking their nuclear weapons from one location to another, and all that. And they have always maintained that we have not ruled out the nuclear option. But having said that, in my opinion, this is still nuclear saber rattling. It worries me because, of course, like anybody else who has any understanding of what the nuclear weapons are, you would not want to push your adversary or the war in some misjudgment or judgment of error actually lands you in a position where the nuclear button is pressed. So I think that is the complication. In terms of the battle line, what is happening is that so the much touted Ukrainian counteroffensive began. It's been almost 4 or 5 months since it began. Russians from the beginning have rejected the Ukrainian counteroffensive and said the Ukrainian counteroffensive is a failure. Okay, so there are two ways to look at it. Of course, you have to understand that Ukrainian counteroffensive it has not performed the way everybody was expecting it to perform. The reason being that you have to understand that Russians have in that entire east to south, east to southeast to southern axis where the war is happening. Russia definitely has mined that entire area, and they have the numerical superiority in terms of they have far more men in their reserves. Ukraine has also lost a lot of men. So what is happening is that there are basically two axes to the counteroffensive, and this is something which is important to understand, because otherwise you cannot understand the Russia-Ukraine war. The one axis is where there is fighting going on at the battlefront, which is on the land battle, which is happening on the battlefront, where you may have heard that last year it was the Battle of Bakhmut, which became a meat grinder, and eventually that the Wagner fighters had taken, from Ukraine. So that was maybe Russia's biggest victory. And this year now, of course, there is already a grinding battle of attrition perpetuating in the city of Advivka. Okay, so you may be hearing that Advivka, Russia is really doubling down on its offensive, in Advivka region, and I think they have, just like Bakhmut, they are also now going to focus on Advivka a lot. But that's one side of the story. Again, in that axis, in the battlefront, in the land, fighting. Of course, you also see Ukrainians are taking back certain villages. But in the bigger scheme of things, Mehraj, it doesn't really mean a lot, because even if you were to take back village after village, you can't really eject the Russian soldiers, right? That's not possible. So I think Ukraine also knows that. And if I have been correct in my reading of the Ukrainian intelligence and Budanov, etc., these people, I think they also understand both sides have been adapting. And what they have been doing for many months now is that while there is fighting happening on the battlefront and Ukraine is taking back its territory, Russia is sending waves after waves of troops because Russia has more numerical superiority. But that is one side. The other side is that Ukraine is now becoming more and more adept in attacking Russian facilities, and especially their military targets, etc., in the region of Crimea. And there have been, attacks within Russian territory on Russian logistics. So these are the two axes on which the counteroffensive is operating. The axis number one that I just told you about, which is the land fighting, you cannot expect major results or mega results from there, precisely because of the fact that this entire area is manned and that Russian army outnumbers the Ukrainians. So you would find it very, very difficult for, smaller battalions and, those kind of forces to actually gain a big victory here, although they are taking the villages, but it doesn't mean too much in the larger scheme of things, in my opinion. What the Ukrainian strategy is that they try to pressurize Russia by sort of isolating Crimea. They have already, attacked on the Kerch Bridge as attack has happened. They've already attacked, Russian submarines, the Russian warships, which were dry docked. I mean, all that has been happening, and it's been quite unprecedented. They've taken down the S-400s. So all that is happening. So I think the Ukrainian strategy is to try and make this war untenable for Russia. The Russian strategy is to overwhelm Ukraine and to wear Ukrainians out, because for sure they have the numerical superiority, and they are also very, I would say, they are also, there is also a dense, so to say, wave of aerial attacks on, like, for example, a few days ago, there was an attack and I think about 50 or 60 Ukrainian civilians died. So these are all tactics to break the psychological resolve of the Ukrainians. But if you look at it from an analyst perspective, this is exactly what a war of attrition looks like. And I think President Putin's strategy is to wait until 2024 and see who is coming as the next president of America, and depending upon that, you can very well deduce what sort of help would the US be able to send to Ukraine, and depending upon that, I think President Putin is likely to double down and, so to say, kind of overwhelm the Ukrainians by aerial bombings, and then so it is very much possible. Or if the Ukrainian strategy is right, and if they go on intensifying their attacks on, say, Crimea, and if they are able to, which I don't think it's impossible, but it's still very difficult. If they are able to take back Crimea, it could be a blow, to President Putin's legitimacy in Russia. And so that is the Ukrainian. I'm trying to make you understand what is the respective, the two sides approach to the war. So honestly, the Ukrainians are in a more precarious situation because they are also losing their civilians. Perhaps so far you may not have heard that Russian civilian casualties have not happened. So Ukraine is hitting Russia whenever they hit Russia, whichever territory they hit or whatever logistics they hit, they are very sure to not attack a civilian, so to say, or to for that, you have to somewhere see that the Ukrainians are using better precision, guided munitions. On the contrary, Russia is really attacking on the civilian and infrastructure and people. So this is also a battle of nerves. It is also a battle of, I would say, 155 shells, because those are the shells that they are fighting. I mean, each side is firing, a lot. And then thirdly, it is all about the pattern of American aid. So for sure, I think President Putin knows that once America stops supporting Ukraine with whatever they are supporting, Europe will not be in a position to support Ukraine militarily. So it could, I think fighting will still continue even if Russia takes the region of, Donetsk and these regions that it announced as Russian territory last year in September when they held a referenda. But like I'm saying is that a gray zone conflict can still go on, and perhaps this will go on for many, many years if Ukraine is not able to actually have a breakthrough. So I think I would be very skeptical of any major, so to say, news coming from that side. But like I said, that the attack by Hamas on Israel has also posed questions on what is going to be the nature of American aid to Ukraine under these changed circumstances. So I would be keeping my fingers crossed, and I would not jump the gun and say that who has won the war. Of course, if you ask me, it is very, very clear that this war is already into its second year. If you look at it carefully, let's look at the winners and the losers. So far, it is not about who wins or loses. Technically, it is about what impact one country is having on its geopolitical, geostrategic, geoeconomic caliber in the world. And from that perspective, I think the clear winner of the war is China. US is also a winner of the war because US's adversary is getting bled, okay, with the only 2% of, US's defense budget. Ukrainians are fighting for the US, so there's a way of looking at it. So I think China and US have quite won the war in terms of, their, so to say, reassertion as the major two great powers in the world. Europe has lost the war because Europe is somewhere facing the brunt of whether it is to diversify away from Russian energy, cheap Russian energy, or whether is it about, say, the rise of the right wing out there. There is a very clear, palpable public unrest about how far the war will go. Russia will remain to be a part of European theater. And no matter what happens in Russia, see, the rest of the world does can't really care about that 16, 17% of land. But what matters is that what sort of a security architecture will be put in place. And that is where Europe is having a major nightmare because I mean, they have been living off the peace dividend for many, many decades, and they had got used to it. So they don't have the right instruments of state policy to put together a credible security architecture. They say it, but I'm not sure how can they do it without really perpetrating a major cause. There is already a lot of unrest. So, in that sense, I think Europe has lost the war, okay, that way. And Russia, yes, I would say Russia has lost the war already. It doesn't matter about the 16, 17% of that land because Russia was already getting all of its geostrategic ambitions fulfilled before the war had started. Like I said, that is an area, if you understand East Europe, Russia had been keeping that entire region destabilized to its advantage for many, many decades. Okay. Before the war, NATO was already fractured. America had pivoted away. Europe was far more dependent on Russian gas than ever before. They already had Nord Stream 1, then they had Nord Stream 2. Their dependence on Russian energy would have increased. China and Russia were already together. They had done what is known as the no limits friendship, etc. Europe was always also dependent on China. India-Russia ties were great. So Russia was having major influence in Africa. The Russia-Africa summit, when it happened for the first time, saw the attendance of 43 African countries. But now, when the war is on and the Russia-Africa summit was repeated, only 17 African countries attended it. The reason is very clear. The reason is the problem with respect to food, the food security, because those are the countries where the Ukrainian and Russian grain used to come from Black Sea. Ever since there has been this problem in the Black Sea, the food grains have not been reaching there. Russia, if you know, has recently withdrawn from the grains, the grain initiative, the UN Turkey mediated Ukraine Russia grain initiative. And because of that, there is an unrest. So, like I said, that Wagner, of course, you know that Wagner chief was killed, and he was one of the instruments of Russian policy to actually, so to say, to extend Russian influence in the region of Africa. And with now Prigozhin killed and the second man killed, there is a lot of uncertainty even within Russia. So, of course, they are able to send the hydrocarbons. I mean, the oil and the gas is being sold, but of course, they are not able to make as many profits as they were, simply because of the fact that China gets at a major discount. India was also getting, one of the reasons why we started buying oil from Russia was also because we were getting a discount. So you cannot discount these facts that it has been bad for Russian economy. Now, it is a different question altogether whether Russia is able to cope or to what extent is Russia able to cope. But the fact of the matter is that the rupee ruble mechanism has not been able to work, even though there is enough political will on both sides to make it work. And it cannot work not because of political will, it cannot work because of technical reasons. And I've like many times in different lectures through my writings, I've tried to explain why the rupee ruble mechanism is not able to work, and the problem is happening from the issue. It's coming from there. So, looking at from that perspective, if you look at West Asia, etc., all these countries are very vigorously multi-aligning. They are hedging their bets. They are not depending either on one player alone, because everybody, it's like consequential hedging. So this is this era of consequential hedging. Most of the middle order powers are hedging their bets extremely vigorously, including countries like India, because you know that it's only multi-alignment. So countries that are try to be neutral, try to not take sides, also understand what is happening, because of course it is a drain on Russian economy, it is a drain on Russian diplomatic heft, I mean, so many things I can tell you, like just the region of Central Asia. You see that China is now dominating. China had a summit with the Central Asian Five, which is the five states of Central Asia, and they did not invite Russia. It was unthinkable before the war. It was unthinkable before the war. So even the Central Asians are very, very